before a single soldier climbed out of the trenches, before one bayonet was fixed, before the whistle blew and men ran screaming into the open. The earth itself was already being torn apart. World War I is remembered for its trenches, its barbed wire, its mud. But there is one force that shaped all of it, that forced men underground, that leveled entire cities, that turned open green fields into something that looked like the surface of the moon. That force was not the machine gun. It was not poison gas. It was not even the tank. It was artillery. From 1914 to 1918, artillery was responsible for more than 75% of all casualties on the Western Front. Not the machine gun, not gas, artillery. It shattered fortresses built to last centuries. It turned living men into nothing. It did not just wound, it erased, and it did something else. Something no weapon before it had done on such a scale. It broke the human mind. What soldiers called shell shock, we now call PTSD, and artillery was its cause. Over 100 years later, specialized teams are still recovering live. Unexploded shells from the fields of France and Belgium every single year. The locals call it the Iron Harvest. The ground still gives up its dead. My name is Liam Smith. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through the most destructive artillery weapons of the First World War, their design, their firepower, their range, and through the words of the men who fired these weapons, and the men who survived being on the receiving end. Welcome to World War military history. Let's begin with a weapon that military historians consistently rank as one of the greatest field guns ever built, not just of World War I, but of any war in history, the French 75mm Model 1897, known simply as the French 75, or as French soldiers affectionately called it, La 75. The 75, this gun was not rushed into production in the chaos of war. It was born in total secrecy. Development was overseen by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Albert Deporte at the Bourges State Arsenal. And when it finally entered service with the French Army in 1898, it carried something no other field gun in the world possessed: a hydropneumatic recoil system. When a traditional field gun fired a shell, the entire carriage, wheels, barrel, everything lurched violently backward with the force of the shot. Before the crew could fire again, they had to physically push the gun back into position, re-aim it, and reload. That process cost precious seconds, sometimes a full minute per shot. The French 75 solved this with revolutionary engineering. Its barrel absorbed the recoil completely through a hydraulic buffer and pneumatic recuperator, then returned automatically to its exact original position without the carriage wheels moving even a single inch. The gun stayed perfectly on target. Combined with a fast-action Nordenfeld eccentric screw breech and a well-trained crew, the French 75 could fire between 15 and 20 rounds per minute. 20 rounds per minute. A rate of fire the world had never seen from a field artillery piece. The weapon was horse-drawn or tractor-drawn and operated by a crew of 6 men. Behind the gun sat an ammunition chest called a caisson, which held over 72 rounds of 75mm ammunition, shrapnel shells, high explosive rounds. smoke shells, and gas. Its standard range was 8.5 kilometers. By 1918, improved ammunition pushed that to 11 kilometers. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. At the Battle of Verdun in 1916, one battle, 1 year, the French 75 fired 16 million shells. Across the entire war, estimates suggest the gun fired over 200 million rounds in total. Soldiers on the front became so familiar with artillery that they could identify different guns purely by sound. One French combatant described the 75 this way: "The French 75 had a sharp and decisive tone. It spoke quickly, and it spoke in anger." But even the finest weapons have limits. The French 75 had a maximum elevation of just 18 degrees. It was designed for flat, direct fire warfare, not for lobbing shells in high arcs into deeply fortified trench systems or underground bunkers. The plunging fire needed to destroy a fortress was beyond its design. Despite this, the French 75 remained in frontline service until the very last day of the war. It was later mounted as the main armament of the Saint-Chamond tank in 1918, and would see action again in the Second World War, a weapon so fundamentally sound that it outlasted an entire generation of conflict. On the other side of the wire, the Imperial German Army went to war with its own standard field gun, the 7.7 centimeters Feldkanone 96 Neue Art. Soldiers simply called it the FK-96NA. Introduced in 1904, the gun combined the barrel of the earlier FK-96 model with a new horizontal sliding block breech and a hydro spring recoil system. Germany had built this weapon around a core military philosophy: mobile warfare. Strike fast, advance quickly, outmaneuver the enemy before he can dig in. But that philosophy came with trade-offs. The FK-96NA was lighter than both the British 18-pounder and the French 75. It fired a lighter shell. Its range, between 5.5 and 8.4 kilometers, fell short of its rivals. There was another serious problem. Unlike the British and French guns, which kept their sights fixed independently while the barrel elevated, the FK-96NA's sights elevated with the barrel itself. The only practical way to extend the gun's range was to dig the rear trail into the ground to increase the angle. Slow, exhausting, and dangerous work to perform under enemy fire. German frontline troops voiced serious frustrations with this weakness throughout the war. It was one of the main reasons Germany rushed development of the upgraded FK-16 in 1916, which featured a longer barrel, a box carriage for greater elevation, and significantly extended range. But before any of these men ever reached the front, they underwent months of punishing training. Paul Osterreicher served with the Bavarian 4th Field Artillery Regiment and trained at Ashburg. In his memoir, he recorded the daily reality of that preparation with complete honesty. He wrote, "The training began at 4 in the morning. Before dawn, we were already out with the guns. In the afternoon came horse cleaning and horse riding. It was quite hard for a young boy not used to any of it, and those of us who had volunteered were truly ridiculed. They called us second-class human beings. People would say, 'How could anyone be so stupid as to join this voluntarily?' Despite the doubts of the recruits, the FK-96NA remained a capable weapon. It fired 5 types of ammunition: high explosive, shrapnel, a universal shell, anti-tank rounds, and gas. The universal shell weighed 85 kilograms and contained over 300 lead shrapnel balls packed around TNT, with a black powder bursting charge at the base. Its flat trajectory limited its effectiveness against deeply fortified positions, the same limitation shared by the French 75. But in the open mobile warfare of the war's early months, it performed exactly as its designers had intended. Germany would spend the rest of the war trying to fix what the trenches had exposed. Before we move to the heavy siege guns, we need to understand the single most terrifying tactic that artillery made possible, one that would define infantry combat for the rest of the 20th century. The creeping barrage. Imagine a wall of exploding shells rolling forward across no man's land, meter by meter, minute by minute, while your own infantry advances just behind it. Shells landing 50 meters ahead of your own men. Walk too slowly, and you are caught in the open. Walk too quickly, and you walk into your own fire. The genius of this tactic was in what it prevented. Enemy defenders sheltering in bunkers from the storm of shells could not man their machine guns until the barrage had passed. By the time they climbed back to the surface, the attacking infantry was already in their trench. Timing was everything. Communication between artillery batteries and advancing infantry was primitive. Field telephones, signal rockets, runners carrying messages on foot. If the barrage lifted too early, the defenders had time to recover. If it fell short, friendly troops were killed by their own guns. A French artillery observer named Henry Lorne survived the Battle of Verdun in 1916, a battle where the artillery fire never truly stopped for months on end. In his memoir, he tried to describe what it looked and felt like from ground level. He wrote, "You could see it, especially at night. The light of the German guns in the darkness, and then the light of each shell as it exploded. When a shell hit a tree instead of the ground, the roar was different, tremendous, cracking, close. Clouds of black smoke rose everywhere, colors, blue, red, yellow, orange. It looked like fireworks. But it was not fireworks. Men were dying inside those colors. That image, fireworks made of death, is perhaps the most haunting single description of an artillery bombardment that any survivor of the Great War left behind." The British Army went to war in 1914, having learned bitter lessons from the Boer War a decade earlier. They knew they needed not just a reliable light field gun. They needed serious, long-range heavy artillery capable of demolishing fortified positions. The answer was the BL 60 pounder, a 127mm field gun introduced in 1904. It became the backbone of British heavy artillery throughout the First World War. The gun fired a shell weighing 27.3 kilograms to a range of 9.4 kilometers. Throughout the war, upgrades to the barrel and improvements in shell quality extended that range to 4 kilometers, making it one of the most capable heavy field guns on the Western Front. Operating a weapon like this was not simple. It required precise, coordinated teamwork, and an understanding of mechanical processes that many of these men, farmers, shopkeepers, students just months earlier, had never encountered in their lives. Leonard Onsworth of the Royal Garrison Artillery recorded the loading and firing procedure in extraordinary detail. He wrote, "First you placed the shell into the breech, then rammed it home with a long tool called a drift. You stood with your back to the gun to do it properly. Then came the cartridge. You closed the breech block and rotated it 60 degrees to lock all the threads together. A small ignition tube was inserted and turned 90 degrees. You hooked the lanyard into a metal ring. When you pulled it, a bright flash, like striking a match but violent, and the shell was gone." What he described sounds almost routine. But there was nothing routine about standing next to a gun that could kill you without a moment's warning. The most feared event for any heavy artillery crew was a premature shell, a round that detonated inside the barrel before it cleared the muzzle. There was no warning, no time. The gun simply ceased to exist, and so did the men around it. Faulty manufacturing, worn barrels, defective fuses, all could cause a premature. Crews developed a kind of permanent alertness, watching for signs that were usually invisible until it was too late. The BL 60-pounder was upgraded multiple times during the war and continued in service through the Second World War. A design so fundamentally sound that it outlasted not one but two global conflicts. And now, the weapon that made the entire world tremble, the Krupp 42cm Gamma Garret siege howitzer. Known to history by a single, unforgettable name, Big Bertha, designed in 1911 by the German steel manufacturer Krupp in Essen. This was not simply a large artillery piece. It was a siege engine, a weapon of a kind not seen in European warfare since the medieval era, except that instead of stones and battering rams, this one threw shells weighing over 1,000 kilograms. The numbers are staggering. Big Bertha weighed 43 tons. It required a crew of between 200 and 240 men to operate. It took 6 full hours to assemble and was transported disassembled on heavy-duty railway carriages and specialized vehicles. Its barrel elevated to between 40 and 75 degrees, allowing it to fire plunging shells that dropped almost vertically onto their targets. Its shells ranged in weight from 810 to 1,160 kilograms. They could penetrate 40 feet, 12 meters, of reinforced concrete and compacted earth before detonating. Its maximum range was 12 kilometers. It could fire a rate of 12 shells per hour. Only 12 Big Berthas were ever built. 12 in August 1914, 2 prototype Big Berthas arrived at the Western Front and were immediately turned on the ring of Belgian forts surrounding the city of Liège. Fortresses built with modern concrete and steel, designed to withstand any artillery then known. No one had designed them to withstand this. A Belgian civilian watched the weapon arrive and recorded what he saw. He wrote, "The monster advanced in 2 parts. The pavement trembled beneath it. The crowd went completely silent, frozen with dread and disbelief. Then came the explosion. The crowd was thrown backward. The earth shook like an earthquake. Every window in the vicinity shattered at once. On the 15th of August 1914, Big Bertha fired 25 heavy shells over 2 hours at Fort Lonson. The final shell struck the fort's main ammunition magazine directly. The explosion that followed killed most of the garrison instantly. Colonel Victor Naessens was inside Fort Lonson when it happened. In the moments before the end, he recorded this: the ventilation had failed. The fort was already filling with concrete dust, thick and choking. The men's chests heaved just trying to draw air. Everything was breaking down around us. Soldiers on both sides gave the gun her name, a reference to Bertha Krupp, heiress and owner of the Krupp manufacturing empire that built it. Allied forces would later use the nickname loosely for all German heavy siege weapons, including the terrifying Paris gun of 1918, which shelled the French capital from 120 kilometers away, making it the longest-range artillery piece ever used in combat up to that point in history. But Big Bertha's enormous size was also its fatal weakness. Its massive profile made it highly vulnerable to counter-battery fire from the Allies. By early 1916, faulty premature shells were detonating inside the barrels themselves, destroying the guns from within. Several were permanently put out of action. 2 were officially destroyed by their own ammunition. The age of the super heavy siege gun was ending, not because the enemy had defeated it, but because the weapon's own scale made it impossible to sustain in the field. Artillery did not just win battles in World War I. It defined the entire character and nature of the war itself. It is the reason the trenches were dug so deep, because only underground could men survive what was coming down from the sky. It is the reason armies developed the creeping barrage, counter-battery fire, and entirely new doctrines of warfare, all built around managing the power of this single weapon type. It is the reason the term shell shock entered the vocabulary of medicines. The human mind, subjected to days and weeks and months of relentless bombardment, broke in ways that no one in 1914 had anticipated or understood. Men arrived at casualty stations unable to speak, unable to walk, shaking uncontrollably, their bodies untouched, their minds destroyed. The army called them cowards. History now knows the truth. It is the reason no man's land looked the way it does in every photograph you have ever seen. A lunar landscape of overlapping craters, stripped of every tree, every blade of grass, every trace of the world that existed before the guns began. And it is the reason why. More than 100 years later, farmers in France and Belgium still plow up live artillery shells from the soil of their fields every single spring. The Iron Harvest. A war that will not end. The French 75, the German FK-96, the British 60-pounder, Big Bertha. These were not simply machines. They were the architects of a new kind of war, one where the battlefield itself became the weapon, one where industrial scale replaced individual courage as the deciding factor. The men who fired these guns, and the men who survived being on the receiving end, understood something we can only try to imagine from a century away. They understood that in this war, the sky itself had become the enemy, and somehow most of them kept going. My name is Liam Smith. If you found this video valuable, please give it a like and subscribe to World War Military History. Your support makes this research possible. And as always, a special thank you to my parents for reviewing every video before it goes live. I'll see you in the next one.